Sir, I don't care about the ticket. This is airline property. You need to leave the gate area.
I understand your position, officer. However, I am a contracted customer who has been illegally denied a service I paid for.
I'm not going to ask you again.
The air in JFK's Terminal 4 was a familiar symphony of chaos, a frantic, multilingual orchestra of rolling luggage, final boarding calls, and the low hum of thousands of intersecting journeys. At Gate B24, the crowd for Airline Flight 815 to London Heathrow was a thick, anxious knot of humanity. Business travelers in rumpled suits checked their watches. Families tried to corral restless children, and students with oversized backpacks looked for any available inch of floor space. It was 3:15 p.m., and the New York sun cast long, lazy rectangles of light across the polished floor. Solomon Johnson stood patiently in the priority boarding lane, a picture of relaxed confidence amidst the tension. He wore a Loro Piana tracksuit in a deep storm gray, the cashmere fabric hanging with an effortless drape that whispered its four-figure price tag. On his feet were a pair of unreleased Aimé Leon Doré for New Balance sneakers, and on his wrist, a Patek Philippe Nautilus with a muted olive green dial sat unpretentiously. At 38, he possessed the lean physique of a former athlete and a face that held a quiet, observant intelligence. To the undiscerning eye, he was simply a well-dressed, athletic man. To the discerning one, he was a walking collection of quiet, high-end luxury, the kind of wealth that had no need to shout. When he reached the podium, he offered the gate agent a polite nod and presented his phone, the QR code for his first-class ticket glowing on the screen. The agent, a woman named Brenda Walsh, who looked to be in her late 20s, had a name tag pinned crookedly to her navy blue uniform. She had a severe blonde ponytail and an expression of practiced impatience. Her eyes did a quick, dismissive scan, from his sneakers, up the tracksuit to his face, and a subtle, almost imperceptible sneer tightened the corner of her mouth. It was a look Solomon knew well. It was the look of someone whose internal calculus had just malfunctioned, unable to reconcile his appearance with his position in the first-class line. Brenda did not scan the ticket. Instead, she tapped a few keys on her terminal, her movements deliberately slow. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice dripping with a false, saccharine politeness that was more insulting than outright hostility. "It seems this flight has been overbooked. We've had a significant number of our Platinum Elite members check in." Solomon's expression didn't change. He kept his voice even and low. "I believe you'll find my ticket was purchased and confirmed 2 months ago. Seat 1A. She offered him a tight, insincere smile. "These things happen, sir. The system automatically prioritizes our highest-tier loyalty members in overbooking situations. I'm sure you understand." Through the large window behind her, Solomon could clearly see the first-class cabin. It was only half full. At least 4 seats, including the coveted 1A, were conspicuously empty. He gestured subtly with his chin towards the aircraft. "It doesn't appear to be full. Perhaps there's been a mistake in your system." Brenda's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of irritation. Her assumption had been challenged, and she didn't like it. "Sir, our system is accurate. The seat you thought you had has been reallocated. There's no need to hold up the line." She spoke loudly, ensuring the passengers behind him could hear, painting him as the source of the delay, the unreasonable troublemaker. A few people shuffled their feet, murmuring impatiently. "I'm not trying to hold up the line," Solomon said, his voice still a model of calm. "I'm trying to get to the seat I paid for. Could you please just scan my boarding pass? It's linked to my Nexus Corp corporate account. It should resolve any confusion." He mentioned the company name deliberately, a small test. To anyone in the tech or financial world, Nexus Corp was a titan, an empire of software, AI, and venture capital he had built from the ground up. Brenda's eyes glazed over with incomprehension. The name meant nothing to her. To her, he was just a guy in a tracksuit trying to scam his way into a seat he didn't belong in. "Sir, I've already told you the situation. Creating a scene isn't going to change anything." Her voice was now sharp, laced with condescension. "I can put you on the standby list for the next flight to London, which leaves in about..." 7 hours. Or I can see if there's a middle seat left in coach on this flight. The choice was an insult disguised as a courtesy. Each option was designed to humiliate, to put him in his place. He was being told in no uncertain terms that he did not belong. The passengers behind him were now openly staring. He saw the flicker of judgment in some of their eyes, the weary annoyance in others. They saw what Brenda wanted them to see: a problem. Solomon held her gaze for a long moment, not with anger, but with a profound, dispassionate clarity. It was as if he were an anthropologist observing a predictable yet disappointing ritual. He had faced this his entire life: the subtle slights, the assumptions, the gatekeepers of small kingdoms who wielded their tiny sliver of authority like a weapon. He could argue. He could demand a supervisor. He could raise his voice and create the very scene she was accusing him of making. But he knew, with the cold certainty of long experience, that it would be pointless. Arguing with a person whose conclusion was set before the conversation even began was a fool's errand. So he did none of those things. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if accepting her verdict. "I see," he said softly. He then took a single step back from the podium, away from the boarding line. The quiet retreat seemed to satisfy Brenda, who flashed a triumphant smirk before calling out, "Next passenger, please." Solomon walked a few feet away, stopping beside a pillar. He ignored the stares and the whispers. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't search for a customer service number. He didn't open a social media app to complain. He tapped a single name on his favorites list, a direct, encrypted line to the man who ran his personal financial empire. The call connected in a single ring. "David," Solomon said, his voice still perfectly level, a stark contrast to the storm gathering within the digital and financial worlds. "Initiate the Phoenix Protocol. Airline Airlines, full acquisition, no ceiling." He listened for a moment, then added, "Effective immediately. I'll be out of contact for the next hour." He ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and stood by the pillar, a silent, solitary figure watching the final passengers board the plane that he, in 45 minutes, would own. The silence that followed the call was, for Solomon, a space of profound and focused intent. He didn't pace. He didn't sigh in frustration. He simply stood, his back against the cool metal of the support pillar, and observed. The world around him continued its frantic dance, oblivious to the tectonic shift he had just set in motion. To everyone else at Gate B24, he was a defeated man, a person who had been put in his place and had accepted it. He was a non-entity, a minor inconvenience that had been smoothed over. Brenda Walsh certainly saw him that way. She occasionally shot him a glance, a flicker of smug satisfaction in her eyes, before turning back to her screen with an air of self-importance. Solomon's mind, however, was miles away, operating on a level of strategy and consequence that was unimaginable to anyone in the terminal. The Phoenix Protocol was not a simple command. It was a term he and his chief financial officer, David Chen, had coined for a specific, rarely used strategy, a corporate blitzkrieg. It was designed for moments like this, moments of profound institutional failure or insult that required a response so overwhelming, so definitive, that it would not only solve the immediate problem, but restructure the very landscape on which the problem occurred. It was not about revenge, it was about radical top-down correction. He watched the boarding process with an analyst's eye. He noted the inefficiency of the staff, the worn-out carpeting near the gate, the flickering departure screen. He saw the way the flight attendants offered perfunctory smiles to the passengers, their eyes already distant. These were not the actions of a premium world-class airline. They were signs of a deeper issue, a corporate culture that had grown complacent, arrogant, and, as he had just experienced, poisoned by prejudice. His decision, made in a split second of cold fury, now felt less like a reaction and more like a necessary, if brutal, act of corporate hygiene. A family with 2 young children struggled with their carry-on bags, blocking the jet bridge entrance. Brenda tapped her pen on the counter impatiently instead of offering to help or calling for assistance. Solomon logged the detail. It was another data point in a rapidly growing file in his mind. An airline's health wasn't just in its balance sheet, it was in these small, human interactions. Airline was failing. He thought of David Chen, a man who operated with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a shark. Right now, David would be in the Nexus Corp Tower in Midtown Manhattan, standing in the center of the firm's primary trading floor. He would have assembled the Phoenix team, a select group of his most brilliant and aggressive traders, analysts, and lawyers. The command, "No ceiling," was the most critical part of the instruction. It meant that cost was no object. It unshackled his team from all budgetary constraints, allowing them to move with a speed and force that Wall Street would be utterly unprepared for. They wouldn't just be buying stock. They would be launching a financial shock and awe campaign. The initial phase would be algorithmic. High-frequency trading bots programmed by Nexus's own AI division would begin buying up Airline stock in small, seemingly random blocks across dozens of different exchanges to avoid triggering automated trading halts. Simultaneously, the legal team would be drafting the tender offer, a public, aggressive bid to buy all outstanding shares at a significant premium over the current market price. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a declaration of conquest. Solomon felt his phone vibrate gently in his pocket. A single encrypted message from David. Phase 1 initiated. Market is blind. He read it without changing his expression and slipped the phone away. The first ripples had been sent out. Soon they would become a tidal wave. Back at the gate, the final boarding call for Flight 815 echoed through the terminal. Final call for Airline 815 to London Heathrow. All passengers should now be on board. Brenda and her colleague began preparing to close the flight, their conversation a low murmur. They were likely discussing their shift change, their plans for the evening, utterly unaware that the very ground beneath their feet was about to give way. They believed they had won a small victory, asserted their authority over a man they had judged and found wanting. Solomon felt no satisfaction in what was coming for them personally. Their actions were a symptom of a larger disease. You didn't cure cancer by treating a single tumor, you attacked the entire system. And that's what he was doing. Brenda Walsh and her assumptions were merely the point of entry, the exposed nerve that had revealed the sickness within the entire corporate body of Airline Airlines. He thought back to the countless times he had endured lesser versions of this. The store clerks who followed him, the valets who handed him a ticket and told him the employee parking was around the back, the real estate agents who politely informed him that the property was unfortunately no longer available the moment he walked through the door. For years, his response had been to simply rise above it, to prove them wrong through sheer success. He had built an empire on the fuel of their low expectations. But today was different. Today, the insult was not just personal, it was institutional. An employee of a publicly traded company, a service provider with whom his corporation spent millions of dollars a year, had denied him a contracted service based on prejudice. This wasn't just an insult. It was a breach of contract. It was a fiduciary failure, and it required a fiduciary response. The jet bridge door was being prepared for closure. The ground crew was visible on the tarmac below, getting ready to pull the gateway back. Solomon Johnson remained by his pillar, a solitary island of calm in the bustling terminal. He was no longer just a passenger who had been wronged. He was a force of nature, a financial storm gathering just over the horizon, about to make landfall. And no one at gate B24 had even thought to check the weather. 60 blocks north of JFK, on the 81st floor of the gleaming Nexus Corp Tower, the atmosphere was the antithesis of Solomon Johnson's calculated calm. The firm's main trading floor, known internally as the Cauldron, was a vast circular room where hundreds of traders normally operated in a state of controlled chaos. But at 3:18 p.m., all that chaos had been focused into a single, silent point of terrifying intensity. David Chen stood at the command podium in the center of the room. He was a compact man in his late 30s, with a mind that moved at the speed of light, and a reputation for legendary composure. But the order he had just received had caused a rare, visible flicker of astonishment to cross his face. Phoenix Protocol was a phrase he had heard only twice before, and both times it had resulted in the complete reshaping of a market sector. The addendum, no ceiling, was unprecedented. "All right, people, listen up." David's voice cut through the low hum of the servers, sharp and clear. The members of the Phoenix team, 7 of the most elite financial minds on the planet, were already assembled around him, their faces a mixture of shock and adrenaline-fueled anticipation. They had been pulled from their desks with a single cryptic summons. "The target is Airline Airlines, ticker ARLN. The order from Mr. Johnson is full acquisition, hostile. We are live as of 60 seconds ago." A collective intake of breath rippled through the group. Airline was a legacy carrier, an S&P 500 company worth billions. It wasn't some floundering startup. A hostile takeover of this magnitude was usually the work of months of planning, of secret negotiations and shareholder activism. They were being ordered to do it in an afternoon. "Is he serious?" asked Maya Singh, the head of algorithmic trading, her fingers already flying across a holographic interface, pulling up Airline's real-time financials. "Phoenix is never a suggestion," David replied curtly, his eyes scanning a dozen data streams at once. "He said no ceiling. That means we don't stop. We don't slow down. We buy until we own it. Maya, deploy the Wraith algorithms. Multiple exchange, fragmented purchasing. I don't want their systems to see a monster at the gate. I want them to see 1,000 ghosts in the machine. Keep the individual buys under 10,000 shares to avoid triggering the high-frequency trading alerts." "On it," Maya said, her focus absolute. On the massive 360-degree screen that wrapped around the cauldron, complex lines of code began to spool out as her algorithms went to work, unleashing billions of dollars of Nexus capital into the market with surgical precision. "James," David said, turning to the team's lead counsel, James Foreman, "draft the 13D filing and the tender offer. Price it at a 40% premium over today's opening bell. I want it ready to file with the SEC the second we cross the 5% ownership threshold." Under U.S. securities law, any entity acquiring more than 5% of a company's stock must publicly declare its intentions. Their window of stealth was therefore incredibly small. 40%? James raised an eyebrow. "That's aggressive. It's practically giving money away." "The goal isn't profit, James. The goal is speed. The price is designed to be so irresistibly high that it encourages an immediate shareholder capitulation," David explained. "We're not negotiating. We're ending the conversation before it begins. Have it ready in 30 minutes. "Understood," James said, already dictating instructions to his legal team through a wireless earpiece. The cauldron was now a hive of silent, focused activity. Billions of dollars were being moved with a few keystrokes. Complex financial instruments were being leveraged. The team was orchestrating a multi-pronged assault. While Maya's algorithms chipped away at the publicly available stock, another division was already contacting major institutional shareholders, pension funds, investment banks, and mutual funds to execute massive block trades, private transactions of huge numbers of shares. The calls were direct and brutal. "We are offering X price for your entire ARLN holding. The offer is good for the next 10 minutes. Yes or no?" The premium was so high, the offer so sudden, that it created confusion and panic, which was exactly the point. In the world of high finance, hesitation is death. David's strategy was to create a scenario so overwhelming that the logical choice for any shareholder was to take the massive, immediate profit and run. "Sir, we've crossed 1%, a junior analyst reported, his voice tight with excitement. The number on the main screen ticked up. ARLN ownership, 1.01%. "Status on their board of directors?" David asked another team member. "Scattered," came the reply. "CEO is on a flight to Tokyo. CFO is playing golf at Pebble Beach. General counsel is at a conference in Miami. They're decentralized. They won't be able to mount a coordinated defense in time." This was a critical piece of intelligence. A poison pill or a white knight defense, common tactics to fend off a hostile takeover, required a swift, unified board decision. Airline's leadership was, at that exact moment, completely vulnerable. The ownership percentage on the screen ticked higher, 1.87%, 2.54%. The Wraith algorithms were working flawlessly, devouring stock without tripping any alarms on the New York Stock Exchange. The block trades were starting to clear. A pension fund in California had just sold their entire 1.5% stake. An investment bank in London had followed suit. David watched the numbers climb, his expression unreadable. He knew Solomon Johnson better than almost anyone. He knew Solomon wasn't a man given to whims. An order like this, delivered with such cold finality, meant something had happened. Something deeply personal. He didn't know the specifics, but he didn't need to. His job was not to ask why. His job was to execute, to wield the immense financial power of Nexus Corp like a hammer, and to bring it down with absolute world-altering force on the designated target. "We're approaching the 5% threshold," Maya announced, her voice calm but her eyes wide with the sheer velocity of their progress. "SEC filing will trigger in approximately 90 seconds. "Good," David said, a thin, predatory smile touching his lips for the first time. "Let them see the monster. It's too late for them to run." Outside the tower's panoramic windows, the New York City skyline stretched to the horizon, blissfully unaware of the corporate empire that was being conquered from this room, 60 blocks away from a man standing silently by a pillar at gate B24. As the last of the economy passengers shuffled down the jet bridge, a man in a slightly better-fitting but equally drab Airline uniform approached gate B24. He was Mark Peterman, the duty supervisor for the terminal wing. He was in his mid-30s, with a sharp, angular face and the perpetually harried air of a middle manager convinced of his own importance. Brenda had called him not because the situation required it, but as a way of reinforcing her own authority, to show the man in the tracksuit that she could summon a higher power. "What's the issue here, Brenda?" Mark asked, his tone already suggesting that any problem was likely the fault of the passenger, not the staff. Brenda gestured with her head towards Solomon, who was still standing by the pillar, his posture unchanged. "That gentleman in the sweatsuit," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper loud enough for Solomon to hear perfectly. "He had a first-class ticket, but the system reallocated his seat. Flight's overbooked. I explained the situation, offered him the next flight or a seat in coach, and he just stood there, refused to move. He was making a scene." The lie was blatant and unnecessary, yet it was the cornerstone of their shared defense. The problem was not their prejudice, it was his behavior. Solomon noted the instant shift in narrative. He was no longer just a passenger with a ticket issue, he was now a disruptive element. Mark straightened his tie and puffed out his chest slightly, striding over to Solomon with the confidence of a man about to solve a simple problem. "Sir," he began, not waiting for a response, "I'm Mark Peterman, the supervisor here. My agent informed me about the seating issue. I understand you're disappointed." The word disappointed was deliberately chosen, framing Solomon's desire for the multi-thousand-dollar service he'd paid for as a mere emotional whim. Solomon met his gaze. "I'm not disappointed, Mr. Peterman. I'm a ticketed passenger for seat 1A who has been denied boarding without cause." His language was precise, devoid of emotion. He was already building a verbal record. Mark's practiced smile didn't falter. He was used to dealing with difficult people. "Well, in these overbooking situations, the system has to make tough choices. It's all automated. Out of my hands, I'm afraid." He waved a dismissive hand, as if the system were some infallible deity whose will could not be questioned. "But because we at Airline value your business," he continued, the insincerity practically radiating from him, "I'm prepared to make you a special offer. We can get you on this flight in one of our new slimline economy seats." He paused for effect, as if he were bestowing a great gift. "And," he added, reaching into his pocket, "I'm going to personally authorize a $100 travel voucher for you to use on a future Airline flight." He produced the voucher with a flourish. It was a flimsy piece of paper printed with terms and conditions in tiny, unreadable font. It was a scrap, a token meant to placate and dismiss. The monetary value was so comically inadequate for a first-class ticket that the offer was more insulting than no offer at all. Solomon looked from the voucher in Mark's hand to the man's smug face. The entire interaction was a masterclass in corporate condescension. They weren't solving a problem, they were managing a nuisance. They hadn't made a mistake, he was the one who was out of line for not gratefully accepting his demotion. $100, Solomon repeated, his voice flat. He made no move to take the voucher. For a first-class ticket that cost over $8,000. Mark's smile finally wavered. The direct mention of the ticket's cost momentarily threw him off his script. Sir, the voucher is a gesture of goodwill. It's standard procedure. Is it also standard procedure to deny boarding to a ticketed first-class passenger when there are clearly visible empty seats in the cabin? Solomon asked, his gaze drifting pointedly toward the plane's window. The direct, factual question seemed to anger Mark. His mask of professional courtesy slipped, revealing a raw, defensive arrogance. Look, I'm not going to stand here and debate our corporate policy with you. The offer is a coach seat and a $100 voucher. It's a very generous offer under the circumstances. You can either take it, or you can wait 7 hours for the next flight. What's it going to be? We need to close the gate. The ultimatum was delivered with finality. Behind him, Brenda stood with her arms crossed, watching the exchange with a look of vindicated approval. They were a team, reinforcing each other's biases. They were the authority. He was the problem. The narrative was set. Solomon gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He wasn't refusing the offer, he was dismissing the entire premise of their conversation. He looked past Mark, his eyes focused on something far beyond the confines of the gate, as if he were watching a distant ship approach the shore. Neither, he said softly. The response confused Mark. What do you mean, neither? Those are your only options. They are the options you are presenting me with, Solomon corrected him gently. They are not, however, my only options. Before Mark could formulate a reply to this cryptic statement, a new voice cut into the tense standoff. Excuse me? I'm recording this, and I'd like to know why you're refusing to even look at his ticket. The voice belonged to a woman standing a few feet away, her smartphone held up, its camera lens aimed directly at Mark and Brenda. The small red light in the corner of her screen was on. She was live streaming. The private humiliation at Gate B24 was about to become a very, very public affair. The woman holding the phone was Sarah Jenkins. A freelance journalist in her early 30s, Sarah made a living by chasing stories that mainstream media often overlooked, selling her pieces to online news outlets and documentary producers. She had an instinct for injustice and a keen eye for the subtle tells of power abuse. She had been standing in the economy line, heading to London for a story on grassroots political movements, when she first noticed the interaction at the first-class podium. It was Brenda's dismissive posture, the almost invisible sneer, that had first caught her attention. Then she saw the man in the expensive tracksuit, his unnerving calm in the face of such blatant disrespect. Her journalistic senses began to tingle. She had seen this play out before. It was a quiet, insidious form of discrimination, often hard to prove. It was a war of 1,000 paper cuts, of feigned politeness and weaponized bureaucracy. When she saw him step away from the podium and the supervisor, Mark, approach with his puffed-up authority, she knew this was more than a simple ticketing error. This was a story. Without a second thought, she had opened her social media app, hit the Go Live button, and typed a quick, explosive caption. Live from JFK, Airline staff refusing to board a black passenger in first class, denying his ticket is valid. Hashtag Airline dehumanized. Hashtag flying while black. Now she stepped forward, her phone a steady, unwavering eye. I asked you a question, she said, her voice clear and firm, projecting the confidence of someone who knew her rights. Why won't you scan his ticket? He's asked you multiple times. Mark Peterman turned to face her, his expression shifting from arrogance to outright fury. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by another passenger. "Ma'am, this is an official airline matter. It does not concern you. Please put that phone away. You are not permitted to film airline personnel." "Actually, I am," Sarah retorted, not missing a beat. "We're in a public space in a New York airport, and I am documenting a newsworthy event. Now, for the third time, are you going to scan his boarding pass, or are you going to continue to refuse service based on your own assumptions?" Her use of the word assumptions was a targeted strike. It cut through the corporate jargon of overbooking and system priorities and named the real issue. On her phone screen, the viewer count, which had started at a modest 50 of her followers, was suddenly exploding. The hashtag was being shared. The clip of Mark's condescending voucher offer was already being screen recorded and retweeted. The viewer count jumped past 500, then 1,000. A small-scale incident was rapidly going viral. Brenda Walsh, seeing the camera, took a half-step back, trying to position herself out of the frame, her face pale. Mark, however, doubled down. "This passenger is being disruptive," he snapped, pointing a trembling finger at Solomon. "He refused to accept the generous accommodation we offered him. He refused to be downgraded from an $8,000 seat to a middle seat in coach," Sarah corrected him, her voice narrating the events for her growing audience. "The generous accommodation was a $100 voucher. Let's be clear about the facts here." The comments on her live stream were flying by now, a torrent of outrage and support. "This is infuriating. At Airline, is this how you treat your first-class customers? That supervisor is on a power trip. Keep recording. Don't let them bully you." Hashtag Airline dehumanized is trending in New York. Solomon, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, watched Sarah with a flicker of appreciation. She was a stranger, yet she had stepped in, armed with nothing but her phone and a sense of right and wrong. He had not needed her help. His own response was already well underway, a financial tsunami gathering force far from this gate. But he recognized the importance of her actions. She was creating a public record, a testament to the smaller, everyday injustices that people without his resources faced constantly. She was doing the work that held the world accountable. Mark, feeling the situation spiraling out of his control, made a fatal error. He reached out as if to physically block her phone's camera. "I said, turn that off." "Don't you touch me or my property," Sarah warned, her voice dropping to an icy calm. "That would be assault." He froze, his hand hovering in the air. He was completely out of his depth. The rulebook he operated from had no page for this, no script for a scenario where his authority was not only questioned, but publicly dismantled in real time. The crowd of remaining passengers at the gate had now formed a semicircle, their own phones emerging, also recording. The private dispute had become a public trial, and he was the star defendant. He looked desperately from Sarah's unflinching gaze to Solomon's unnervingly placid one. "That's it," Mark said, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and panic. "You're both security risks." He reached for the radio on his shoulder. "This is Supervisor Peterman at Gate B24. I need airport security immediately. We have 2 non-compliant individuals causing a disturbance." On Sarah's live stream, the viewer count passed 10,000. The hashtag was no longer just trending in New York, it was starting to pop up on the national list. The digital witness had done her job. The story was out. And the consequences, like the financial storm brewing in Manhattan, were about to arrive. While the drama at Gate B24 was playing out in the court of public opinion, a far more seismic event was unfolding in the silent, unforgiving world of high finance. At precisely 3:27 p.m., as Mark Peterman was radioing for security, Nexus Corp officially crossed the 5% ownership threshold of Airline Airlines. In the cauldron, a dozen alarms chimed in unison. James Foreman, the lead counsel, hit a single key on his terminal. "Filing submitted," he announced to the room. Instantly, the public declaration of Nexus Corp's stake and its hostile intentions hit the Securities and Exchange Commission's servers. From there, it blasted out to every major financial news terminal in the world: Bloomberg, Reuters, The Wall Street Journal. For the first few moments, there was only confusion. There had been no rumors, no leaks, no activist posturing. ARLN had been a stable, if unremarkable, stock all day. This move came out of nowhere, a shark appearing in a swimming pool. Then, the chaos began. On the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, the trading post for ARLN erupted. Traders who had been sleepily watching the stock do nothing all day were suddenly screaming, jostling, trying to understand the tidal wave of buy orders that were flooding their systems. The stock price, which had been hovering around $42.50, leaped. It jumped $1, then $2, then $5, in a matter of seconds. The market was desperately trying to price in the 40% premium Nexus was offering in its tender bid. Automated circuit breakers, designed to halt trading in a stock experiencing extreme volatility, kicked in. ARLN was frozen for 5 minutes, but this pause did nothing to quell the panic. It only amplified it. In boardrooms and on trading floors across the globe, the question was the same. Who is Nexus Corp, and why are they buying an airline? While Nexus was well known in tech and private equity, it had no history in transportation. The move seemed illogical, irrational. But David Chen and his team were counting on that confusion. While their competitors were asking why, the Phoenix team was focused only on how. The trading halt was a momentary inconvenience. David had already anticipated it. "The halt gives us 5 minutes of darkness," David said to his team, his voice cutting through the tension. "Their board is probably just hearing the news now, scrambling to get on a conference call. They're going to try to mount a defense. We need to be in a checkmate position before they can even get their king on the board. Release the hounds." Releasing the hounds was code for Phase 2. The moment the trading halt lifted, Maya Singh unleashed a new suite of even more aggressive algorithms. These weren't the subtle wraith bots from before. These were battering rams, programmed to buy any and all available ARLN stock at almost any price. The no-ceiling directive was now in full public view. Simultaneously, the block trade offers to institutional investors were reissued with an even shorter 2-minute deadline, creating an intense fear of missing out on the massive payday. When trading resumed, the stock didn't just climb, it exploded. It gapped up to $55, then $58. Anyone holding Airline stock was seeing a year's worth of gains materialize in a single minute. The temptation to sell was overwhelming. Short sellers, investors who had bet on the stock price going down, were being annihilated, forced to buy back shares at a massive loss, which only drove the price higher. It was a perfect, vicious cycle of financial destruction and creation. In his office at a rival airline, the CEO of United was staring at his Bloomberg terminal in disbelief. "Get our board on the line now," he barked at his assistant. "I want to know what this means for us." In London, the head of British Airways was doing the same. Solomon Johnson's move was not just an attack on one company. It was a shockwave sent through the entire global airline industry. It signaled the arrival of a new, unpredictable, and terrifyingly powerful player. Back in the cauldron, the ownership percentage was climbing at a dizzying rate: 12%, 17%, 24%. The sheer financial firepower Nexus was deploying was staggering. They were on track to spend upwards of $3 billion in less than an hour. "We have the California Teachers Pension Fund on the line," an analyst shouted. "They hold 4%. They're panicking. They want to know if the offer is real." "Tell them the offer is real and it expires in 60 seconds, David commanded without looking up from his screen. "And tell them Solomon Johnson sends his regards." The mention of the name was a power play. It was a reminder that this wasn't some faceless corporation. It was the will of one man, a man who was now personally attached to the largest hostile takeover of the year. The analyst relayed the message. 30 seconds of silence passed, an eternity in the cauldron. Then, a nod. "They're selling," the analyst confirmed, a grin spreading across his face. "We just crossed 30%. A low cheer went through the room. They were still far from the 51% needed for outright control, but they had reached a critical mass. They were now the single largest shareholder by a massive margin. They had enough of a stake to demand board seats, to force policy changes, to effectively control the company's direction. The battle wasn't over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Airline Airlines, whether its executives knew it yet or not, now belonged to Solomon Johnson. The tremors on Wall Street had become a full-blown earthquake, and the epicenter was a man in a tracksuit, waiting for airport security at gate B-24. As the electronic tremors of his corporate raid were shaking the foundations of Wall Street, Solomon Johnson was facing a much smaller, more personal form of confrontation. Mark Peterman, emboldened by the fact that he had called for security, was now trying to reassert his dominance over the scene. The presence of Sarah Jenkins and her live-streaming phone was an irritant, but in his mind, the impending arrival of law enforcement would be the final word. "Sir, you are interfering with flight operations and refusing to comply with a supervisor's instructions," Mark said, directing his speech at Solomon but fully aware of the audience, both in person and online. He was creating a narrative for the security officers. "You've been offered a seat. You've been offered compensation. At this point, your refusal to leave the gate area is becoming a security issue." Solomon decided to make one final attempt to resolve the situation at the lowest possible level. It was a test, not for his own benefit, but for the record. He wanted to demonstrate that he had exhausted every possible avenue of conventional resolution before the true nature of his response was revealed. He reached into the inner pocket of his Loro Piana jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. He withdrew a sleek, minimalist wallet made of black carbon fiber. From it, he produced a single card. The card was matte black, made of anodized metal, and felt heavy and substantial. It bore no numbers, no magnetic strip, only a laser-etched Airline logo and his name, Solomon Johnson. This was not a credit card or a standard frequent flyer card. This was the Airline Chairman's Club card, an invitation-only perk offered to a handful of individuals in the world. CEOs of Fortune 100 companies that spent tens of millions on corporate travel, heads of state, and select billionaires. It was a key that unlocked a hidden world of travel privileges, private unpublished service numbers, access to exclusive airport lounges that weren't on any map, and the absolute unquestioned priority on any flight at any time. The card was, in essence, a corporate get-out-of-jail-free card, a symbol that its holder was not just a customer, but a core pillar of the airline's entire business model. He held the card out for Mark to see. "Mr. Peterman," he said, his voice still low and even, "I suspect this card is not logged in the standard system you've been checking. It is directly linked to my company's corporate travel account. I suggest you look up the privileges associated with it. It should clarify my priority status beyond any doubt." For a moment, Mark was taken aback. The card was unlike any he had ever seen. It had a weight, a seriousness, that gave him a brief pause. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. This was a deviation from the script he knew. People in tracksuits did not typically possess items of such obvious, understated expense. Brenda Walsh, however, saw the gesture not as a presentation of credentials, but as a final, desperate bluff. She leaned over and whispered to Mark, her voice venomous with scorn. "It's probably fake. You can buy things that look like that online. He's just trying to intimidate you." Her whisper was all the reinforcement Mark needed. His brief moment of doubt vanished, replaced by a renewed wave of arrogance. He had been right all along. This man was a fraud. He scoffed, a short, ugly sound of derision. He didn't even touch the card. "Sir, I don't know what that is, and frankly, I don't care," Mark said, waving a dismissive hand. "A fancy piece of metal doesn't change the fact that this flight is closed. You had your chance to accept our offer." He turned to Brenda. "Let's get the flight closed out. The paperwork isn't going to file itself." This was the final insult. It was a complete and utter rejection of reality. He had presented them with incontrovertible proof of his status, a key to the kingdom, and they had looked at it and at him and declared them both to be worthless. It was the purest distillation of prejudice, the refusal to accept any evidence that contradicts a pre-existing bias. On Sarah Jenkins's live stream, the camera zoomed in on the black card in Solomon's hand, then back to Mark's sneering face. The chat exploded. Several viewers, likely high-level business travelers themselves, recognized the card for what it was. OMG, is that a chairman's club card? That supervisor is an idiot. He has no idea who he's talking to. They only give those to heads of state and the top CEOs in the world. This is beyond incompetence. At Airline, you are done. Solomon slowly retracted his hand and placed the card back in his wallet. He had his answer. He had given them one last chance to choose reason, and they had chosen ignorance. He looked at Mark and Brenda no longer with disappointment, but with the detached pity a doctor might feel for a patient who has refused a life-saving treatment. Their fate was now sealed, not by his anger, but by their own stubborn prejudice. At that moment, 2 uniformed airport security officers arrived, their radios crackling. They walked with a heavy, authoritative tread, their eyes scanning the scene. "We got a call about a disturbance," the taller of the 2 officers said, his gaze settling on Solomon. "Thank you for the prompt response, officers," Mark said, his voice slick with relief and triumph. "This individual has been refusing to comply with crew instructions and is holding up our departure procedures." He pointed at Solomon. "I need you to remove him from the gate area." The final insult had been delivered, and the gears of institutional power were now grinding into motion to enforce it. The arrival of the 2 security officers, a man and a woman in the crisp blue and black uniforms of the airport authority, immediately escalated the tension at the gate. The loose circle of onlookers tightened, their phones held higher. This was no longer just a verbal dispute, it was now an official incident. The taller officer, whose name tag read Riley, was a man in his late 30s with a weary, seen-it-all expression. His partner, Officer Evans, was younger, with sharp, observant eyes that took in the entire scene. Solomon's calm demeanor, Mark's agitated state, Sarah's live-streaming phone, and the crowd of witnesses. "What's the problem here?" Officer Riley asked, his voice a low, no-nonsense rumble. His focus was on Mark, the airline employee who had made the call. "This man," Mark said, pointing at Solomon again, as if he were a piece of evidence. "He was ticketed for this flight, but it was overbooked. We offered him alternatives, but he refused to accept them and has declined to leave the gate area. He's being disruptive and non-compliant." Mark carefully used the buzzwords he knew would get a response from security. Officer Riley turned to Solomon. His eyes did the same quick, judgmental scan that Brenda's had, but with a different filter. He wasn't assessing class, he was assessing threat. He saw a tall, physically fit man who was not visibly agitated, not shouting, not making any threatening gestures. Solomon met his gaze directly, his hands relaxed at his sides. "Sir, is what he's saying true? Are you refusing to leave the gate?" Officer Riley asked. Before Solomon could answer, Sarah Jenkins stepped forward slightly, keeping her phone trained on the interaction. "That's not what happened, officer," she interjected. "I have the entire incident recorded." This man was denied his paid, confirmed first-class seat. The supervisor never scanned his ticket, dismissed his credentials, and is now lying about him being disruptive. He has been perfectly calm the entire time. Officer Evans looked at Sarah, then at her phone, noting the active live stream and the rapidly climbing viewer count, which was now pushing past 25,000. She understood immediately that this was not a standard disturbance. This was a public event, and they were now a part of it. She subtly tapped her partner's arm, directing his attention to the phone. Officer Riley's expression hardened slightly. He didn't like being recorded. It complicated things. It meant reports in triplicate and a review by his own superiors. "Ma'am, I need you to step back," he said to Sarah. He then turned back to Solomon. Sir, I don't care about the ticket. This is airline property. If their supervisor wants you to leave the gate area, you need to leave the gate area. We can sort out the ticket complaint later. It was the voice of procedural bureaucracy. The officer's job wasn't to determine who was right or wrong about a ticket. It was to remove the problem as defined by the person in charge of the space. In this case, that was Mark. I understand your position, officer, Solomon said calmly. However, this is not just airline property, it is a public access area, and I am a contracted customer who has been illegally denied a service I paid for. Removing me would be assisting them in a breach of that contract. He was not arguing emotionally. He was stating a legal position. Officer Riley's patience was thinning. Sir, you can make all the legal arguments you want from the main terminal. Right now, you're holding up the departure of an international flight. I'm not going to ask you again. Please come with us. He gestured with his thumb over his shoulder towards the main concourse. The moment had arrived, the point where institutional force would be brought to bear. The crowd gasped. On the live stream, the comments turned into a furious, frantic flood. They're going to arrest him for being a customer? This is an abuse of power. At JFK Airport at Airline, this is your fault. Someone call a lawyer. Mark Peterman watched with a triumphant gleam in his eyes. He had won. The troublemaker was being removed. The natural order of things, as he saw it, was being restored. Brenda, who had been hiding behind the podium, peeked out with a look of pure relief. Solomon Johnson stood his ground, but he did not resist. He simply looked at Officer Riley. Before you do that, he said, his voice still low but now carrying an immense weight, you should know that your actions and the actions of these Airline employees are being documented, not just on this phone, he nodded towards Sarah, but by my own legal team, who are monitoring this situation. The bluff, or what Officer Riley perceived as a bluff, was a common one. Everyone being escorted by security suddenly had a high-powered lawyer. Just walk with me, sir, Riley said, taking a step forward, his hand moving towards Solomon's arm. But before he could make contact, something happened that stopped everyone. A sound, a series of synchronized chimes coming from dozens of phones in the crowd at once. It was a push notification alert. But it wasn't just them. The sound echoed from the TVs above the bars and restaurants down the concourse. Every large screen in the terminal, which had been showing a generic cable news program, suddenly flickered. The red "Breaking News" banner flashed across the bottom of the screens. A news anchor appeared, her face grim and serious. We are coming to you with a major breaking story from Wall Street, she announced, her voice filling the sudden, stunned silence at the gate. Airline Airlines, one of the nation's largest carriers, is the subject of a stunning hostile takeover. The aggressor has been identified as the technology and investment giant Nexus Corporation. A graphic flashed on the screen, a picture of the Airline logo next to the sleek, formidable logo of Nexus Corp. The anchor continued. In a lightning-fast series of trades that has stunned the market, Nexus Corp has acquired a controlling stake in the airline in under 40 minutes. We are now getting confirmation. Yes, we can confirm that the deal is done. Airline Airlines has just been purchased. The new owner is Nexus Corp's founder and CEO. The graphic on the screen changed. The logos were replaced by a photograph. It was a picture of Solomon Johnson from a recent magazine cover, looking powerful and confident in a tailored suit. Solomon Johnson. A collective, disbelieving gasp swept through the gate area. Every single person, the passengers, the security officers, Sarah Jenkins, Brenda Walsh, and Mark Peterman, instinctively turned from the TVs to the man in the Loro Piana tracksuit. The man they were about to physically remove. The man who was, as of 10 seconds ago, the owner of the entire airline. The news anchor's voice echoed in the cavernous terminal, each word landing like a hammer blow on the stunned silence at gate B24. The new owner is Nexus Corp's founder and CEO, Solomon Johnson. Time itself seemed to warp. For a few seconds, the scene was frozen, a tableau of utter disbelief. Officer Riley's hand, which had been reaching for Solomon's arm, remained suspended in midair. Officer Evans's mouth was slightly agape, her professional composure shattered. The passengers in the crowd lowered their phones, their expressions shifting from outrage to awe. Sarah Jenkins, still live streaming, slowly panned her camera from the giant television screen back to the man standing before her, the living embodiment of the impossible news flash. Solomon Johnson's expression did not change. He didn't smile. He didn't betray a hint of triumph. He simply stood there, a fixed point of calm while the world rearranged itself violently around him. The photo on the screen was of a titan of industry. The man before them was dressed for a leisurely afternoon. The cognitive dissonance was a palpable shock to the system for everyone present. It was Mark Peterman who broke the spell. He let out a strange, choked sound, a cross between a laugh and a gasp. No, that's impossible. It's a joke, a prank. He looked frantically between the TV and Solomon, his mind refusing to process the information, to connect the two realities. This couldn't be happening. The man he had just condescended to, the man he had threatened and tried to have removed, was not just some random passenger. He was the boss, the ultimate boss. Brenda Walsh's reaction was more visceral. All the color drained from her face, leaving it a waxy, sickly white. Her eyes were wide with a specific kind of terror, the terror of someone who has just realized they have made a catastrophic, career-ending, life-altering mistake. Her legs felt weak, and she gripped the podium to keep herself from stumbling. The smugness, the arrogance, the casual prejudice, it all curdled into a cold, sickening dread in the pit of her stomach. She had tried to bar the king from entering his own castle and had mocked him for not having the right key. On Sarah Jenkins's live stream, the viewer count didn't just jump. It went supernova. It rocketed past 50,000, then 100,000. The chat was no longer legible, just a waterfall of screaming text and emojis. Holy shit! He bought the whole airline! This is the greatest plot twist of all time! That supervisor is about to be fired! Out of a cannon! Into the sun! Legend! Absolute legend! The news anchor was still talking, providing details that only deepened the shock. Sources on Wall Street are calling this the fastest hostile takeover of a Fortune 500 company in modern history. Nexus Corp reportedly spent over $4 billion in less than an hour, acquiring a stake now estimated to be over 51%. Airline's board was apparently caught completely off guard and was unable to mount any defense. The financial figures, the sheer scale of the power play, were beyond the comprehension of most people at the gate. But they understood the core truth. The man in front of them had the power to buy their entire world on a whim. Officer Riley slowly, very slowly, lowered his hand. He looked at Solomon with a completely new expression, one of deep, profound respect, tinged with a healthy dose of fear. He and his partner exchanged a quick, panicked glance. Their job had just changed from removing a nuisance to potentially detaining the new owner of one of the largest corporate entities operating at their airport. The paperwork for that would be a nightmare. Solomon finally moved. He turned his head slightly to look at Mark Peterman. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence itself was now his amplifier. "Mr. Peterman," he said, and the supervisor flinched as if he had been struck. "You said my only options were a coach seat or the next flight. I believe I told you I would be choosing neither." The quiet, cryptic statement from before now made terrifying sense. It hadn't been a refusal, it had been a promise. A promise of a third option, an option so far outside the realm of their imagination that they had dismissed it as nonsense. Solomon then shifted his gaze to Brenda Walsh, who looked like she was about to be physically ill. He didn't say a word to her. He just looked. The silence was more damning than any reprimand could ever be. In his calm, unblinking gaze, she saw her professional life flash before her eyes and then extinguish. His phone buzzed. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen. It was another encrypted text from David Chen. Phase 3 complete. The crown is yours. Congratulations, sir. He pocketed the phone and looked up just as a new figure came sprinting down the concourse toward their gate, his face pale and beaded with sweat. It was the JFK station manager for Airline, a man who had clearly just received the most terrifying phone call of his life. The spectacle was over. The reckoning was about to begin. The arrival of the Airline station manager, a man named Gerald Finney, signaled the next phase of the incident. Finney was in his late 40s, a career airline man who had spent years climbing the corporate ladder. He was usually a picture of composed authority, but as he ran the final few yards to gate B-24, his tie askew and a sheen of panicked sweat on his brow, all composure was gone. He skidded to a halt, his eyes wide and frantic, scanning the scene. He saw the security officers, the crowd of passengers, and then he saw Solomon Johnson. "Mr. Johnson!" "Sir!" Finney gasped, trying to catch his breath. His voice was filled with a desperate, pleading deference. The corporate headquarters had just called him, the CEO's office itself, screaming at him to get to gate B-24 and handle a situation that had already spiraled into a multi-billion-dollar cataclysm. Solomon simply nodded. "I'm Solomon Johnson." Finney looked at Mark and Brenda, his face a mask of incandescent rage and terror. "What did you do?" he hissed, his voice a choked whisper. He didn't need an answer. He could guess. He had seen the clips that were already circulating online, sent to him by his panicked superiors. Mark Peterman's carefully constructed world of rules and authority had not just cracked, it had disintegrated. The power dynamic had inverted with the force of a supernova. Minutes ago, he was the supervisor, the man in charge, holding all the cards. Now he was a terrified employee standing before the man who held the deed to his entire company. He opened his mouth to try and explain, to justify, to apologize, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. His brain could not supply the words to navigate this new, terrifying reality. He looked like a man who had just watched the laws of physics spontaneously reverse. Brenda Walsh was even worse off. She was visibly trembling, her knuckles white where she gripped the counter. The smug confidence she had worn like a suit of armor was gone, leaving her exposed and utterly terrified. She avoided looking at Solomon, at Finney, at anyone. She stared at a fixed point on the floor, as if hoping the ground would swallow her whole. The authority she had wielded so casually, so cruelly, had been a borrowed, fragile thing. And the man from whom it was ultimately borrowed was standing right in front of her. "Sir," Finney said, turning back to Solomon, his voice now slick with an almost painful level of sycophancy. "On behalf of Airline Airlines, I am so deeply sorry for this unacceptable misunderstanding. There are no words. We will, of course, get you on your flight immediately. We will hold the plane. I will personally escort you to your seat." Solomon held up a hand, a small, simple gesture that nonetheless stopped Finney's torrent of apologies cold. "The flight can wait," Solomon said, his voice cutting through the air with a newfound, effortless authority. "Before I go anywhere, we are going to have a full accounting of what happened here, in public, for the record." He turned his attention back to Officer Riley. "Officer," he said, his tone respectful but firm, "you and your partner are welcome to stay. You are now witnesses to a corporate security and governance review." Officer Riley, who a moment ago was about to physically remove Solomon, now found himself nodding like a subordinate. "Yes, sir. Of course, sir." He and Officer Evans took a half-step back, transitioning from enforcers to observers. They understood they were now witnessing something far outside their pay grade. Solomon then addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice projecting easily across the now silent gate area. "I know you are all eager to get to London. I apologize for this delay. It is the result of a systemic failure that I intend to correct, starting right now. Thank you for your patience." His words were not just an apology, they were a declaration of intent. He was framing the incident not as a personal slight, but as a problem he, as the new owner, was now responsible for solving. He looked back at Mark Peterman, whose face had gone from disbelief to the ashen gray of pure dread. "Mr. Peterman," Solomon began, "a moment ago you called me a security risk. You accused me of being disruptive. You summoned law enforcement to have me removed, all because I asked you to verify a valid, paid-for ticket. Would you say that is an accurate summary?" Mark could only manage a weak, pathetic nod. His authority had so completely collapsed that he was now like a puppet with its strings cut, a hollow uniform with nothing inside. He was no longer a supervisor, he was just a man who had made the biggest mistake of his life, and he was being forced to relive it, sentence by sentence, in front of the entire world. The collapse was total. It was the dramatic, terrifying evaporation of power that comes from a foundation of arrogance and prejudice. Mark and Brenda had built their sense of authority on a fragile set of assumptions about the world, about who belongs where, about what power looks like. Solomon Johnson, by simply existing, had shattered those assumptions, and the news alert had shattered their world. The authority they thought was theirs had vanished, revealing it for what it always was, an illusion. The atmosphere at Gate B-24 had transformed. It was no longer a chaotic boarding area, but an impromptu boardroom, a public tribunal. The defendant was the corporate culture of Airline Airlines, and the judge, jury, and new monarch was Solomon Johnson. Grand Finney, the station manager, stood beside him, a study in frantic obedience, his phone buzzing incessantly in his hand with calls he was now too terrified to answer. "Mr. Finney," Solomon said, turning his attention to the highest-ranking employee present, "let's begin your official review. What is Airline's stated policy on overbooked flights for first-class passengers?" Finney stammered, caught off guard by the direct procedural question. Well, sir, policy is that first-class ticket holders are the last to be involuntarily bumped. It should not happen, especially not to corporate account holders." "It should not happen," Solomon repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "And yet, it did. Your supervisor, Mr. Peterman, insisted it was the system. Is it company policy for employees to blame a non-existent system when they are, in fact, making a discretionary and discriminatory decision?" "No, sir. Absolutely not, sir," Finney said, sweating profusely now. "Employees are trained to de-escalate, to verify credentials, to find a customer-centric solution." "A customer-centric solution," Solomon mused, his eyes drifting to the flimsy $100 voucher still lying on the floor where Mark had presumably dropped it. "Is offering a passenger a 1% refund in the form of a restrictive voucher for an $8,000 breach of contract considered customer-centric in your training manuals?" Every question was a perfectly aimed dart, puncturing the corporate platitudes and exposing the rot beneath. He was using their own language, their own policies, to dismantle them in front of a global audience. Sarah Jenkins's live stream was now being simulcast by major news outlets. The viewer count was in the hundreds of thousands and climbing. Solomon then turned his focus back to Mark, who seemed to be shrinking inside his own uniform. "Mr. Peterman, I presented you with this." He once again produced the Black Chairman's Club card. "What was your response?" Mark's voice was a barely audible whisper. I dismissed it." "You dismissed it," Solomon confirmed. "Mr. Finney, what is the protocol when an employee is presented with a Chairman's Club card?" Finney looked as though he might faint. "The protocol, sir, is to immediately cease whatever the employee is doing, personally escort the cardholder to a private area, and contact the dedicated executive liaison team at corporate headquarters. It is a priority zero directive. Failure to do so is grounds for immediate termination." He said the last part with a gulp, effectively pronouncing Mark's corporate death sentence. A low murmur went through the watching crowd. They were learning, in real time, the secret rules of the corporate world, and witnessing the brutal consequences of breaking them. Brenda Walsh, who had been trying to make herself invisible, finally broke. A small, quiet sob escaped her lips. The sound was pathetic in the charged silence. Solomon's gaze shifted to her. He didn't speak to her. Instead, he addressed Finney. "And what of Ms. Walsh?" Solomon asked. "The employee who initiated this entire confrontation by refusing to even scan a boarding pass. The employee who, I can only assume based on her actions, judged me unqualified to sit in a first-class seat based on my attire and the color of my skin. What part of the Airline training manual covers that particular procedure, Mr. Finney?" The question was a rhetorical kill shot. Finney had no answer. He could only shake his head, his expression one of utter despair. "There is no excuse, sir. None." It was at that moment that Finney's phone rang with a tone he couldn't ignore. The screen showed a name, Anna Reed, CEO. He looked at Solomon with panicked eyes. "Sir, it's the CEO." Solomon nodded. "Answer it. Put it on speaker." The command was quiet, but it was not a request. Gerald Finney's trembling finger tapped the screen. "Hello?" A woman's voice, strained and frantic, came through the phone's speaker, audible to everyone at the gate. "Gerald, what in God's name is happening at your airport? The board is in an uproar. The story is on every network. Is it true? Is Solomon Johnson really there?" Finney, holding the phone like it was a venomous snake, could only look at Solomon. Solomon took a step closer to the phone. "Hello, Anna," he said calmly. "It's Solomon Johnson. Yes, I'm here. I was just having a performance review with your JFK management team. I have to say, so far, I am not impressed." There was a stunned, horrified silence on the other end of the line. The CEO of Airline Airlines was now on a conference call with her new owner, a call being broadcast live from the scene of the crisis he had manufactured. The king was on the phone, and the entire world was listening in. The sound of stunned silence from the other end of the phone line was a powerful testament to the chaos Solomon had unleashed upon Airline's corporate structure. Anna Reed, a CEO who just an hour ago was one of the most powerful women in the aviation industry, was now speechless, her authority rendered moot. "Solomon, Mr. Johnson," she finally stammered, her voice tight with panic. I am on my way to the airport. I can be there in 30 minutes. Please, whatever has happened, we can discuss it privately. We can make this right." "Privacy is a privilege, Anna," Solomon replied, his voice still deceptively gentle, yet carrying the cold weight of absolute power. "Your staff chose to humiliate me in public. Therefore, we will be finding the solution in public. Transparency, after all, is a key component of good corporate governance. Wouldn't you agree?" His use of corporate jargon was deliberate, a signal to her and any board members listening in that this was not an emotional outburst. This was a hostile audit. "Now, Anna," he continued, "I have your JFK station manager, a Mr. Grand Finney, here with me, along with his supervisor, Mr. Mark Peterman, and gate agent, Ms. Brenda Walsh. They have, in the span of 30 minutes, violated at least 4 FAA regulations regarding passenger rights, breached the terms of your own contract of carriage, and committed what appears to be a blatant act of racial discrimination, all of which has been documented by multiple witnesses and is currently being streamed to a global audience. Other than that, they're doing a fine job." The sarcasm was delivered so dryly it was almost undetectable, yet it was devastatingly effective. It laid bare the totality of the failure in a single brutal sentence. What do you want, Solomon?" Anna Reed's voice was barely a whisper now. It was the question of the vanquished. "Want?" Solomon paused, letting the question hang in the air for a moment. "What I want is irrelevant. What I now require, as the majority shareholder and de facto owner of this company, is a demonstration that you understand the severity of this failure. This isn't about me, Anna. This is about every single passenger who has ever been dismissed, disrespected, or discriminated against by your staff, but didn't have the resources to buy the company to get a fair hearing." The crowd at the gate was completely captivated. This was better than any reality show, more compelling than any boardroom drama. This was real power, real consequence, unfolding before their very eyes. Sarah Jenkins kept her phone steady, knowing she was capturing a seminal moment in the history of corporate accountability. Solomon began to walk slowly in front of the gate podium, his movements deliberate, like a lawyer making his closing argument to a jury. Here is what happened, Anna, for the record. At approximately 3:15 p.m., your agent, Ms. Walsh, refused to scan my valid boarding pass for seat 1A. She falsely claimed the flight was overbooked. She made this claim without verifying any information, based entirely on a visual assessment of my person. He stopped and looked at Brenda, who was now openly weeping, her shoulders shaking. When I questioned her, she was dismissive and condescending. Your supervisor, Mr. Peterman, was then summoned. He reinforced her false narrative. He lied, claiming I was making a scene. He offered me a pittance of a voucher as an insult, and then he too refused to verify my credentials, including my chairman's club card, which your own Mr. Finney has just confirmed is a Priority 0 directive. He paused in front of Mark, who stared at the ground, unable to meet his gaze. Finally, Solomon continued, his voice hardening slightly for the first time, when I refused to be shuffled away like a common vagrant, your supervisor escalated the situation by summoning airport security, falsely accusing me of being a threat. He attempted to use law enforcement as a tool to cover up his own incompetence and prejudice. Is that the kind of company you are running, Anna? On the other end of the line, there was only the sound of shaky breathing. Anna Reed knew she was ruined. The board would demand her resignation before the day was out. Her only hope was to placate the new king. No, she said, her voice hollow. It's not, and it won't be, ever again. Tell me what to do. I will do anything you say. Good, Solomon said, because the reckoning is just the first step. The reconstruction comes next. He looked from the faces of the disgraced employees to the watching crowd, and then into the lens of Sarah Jenkins's phone. He was no longer just speaking to the CEO. He was addressing his new customers, his new employees, and the entire world. The public humiliation was complete. The public rebuilding was about to begin. Having publicly dissected the failure, Solomon Johnson seamlessly transitioned from prosecutor to architect. His tone remained level, but the focus of his words shifted from the past to the immediate future. This was no longer about what had been done wrong. It was about what would be done right, starting now. Anna, he said into the phone, his voice resonating with an authority that was now absolute. Your personal fate and that of your executive team will be decided by the new board of directors, which my team is in the process of forming. But the operational changes begin today. They are not negotiable, and they will be implemented immediately. Are you ready to take notes? A faint, "Yes, sir," came from the speaker. First, Solomon declared, his voice clear and sharp, Mr. Peterman and Miss Walsh, their employment with Airlines is terminated, effective immediately. They are to be escorted from the premises, not suspended, not reassigned, terminated. Their final paychecks will be processed, but all stock options and non-vested benefits are forfeited. Is that understood? Yes, Anna whispered. At the podium, Mark Peterman looked up in shock, as if he couldn't believe it was happening, while Brenda Walsh let out a small, wounded cry. They were being fired in front of hundreds of people and a live audience of hundreds of thousands. Second, Solomon continued, undeterred, Mr. Finney, as station manager, you are responsible for the culture and conduct of your employees. You have failed spectacularly. You are hereby demoted from station manager to assistant supervisor of baggage handling, effective immediately. You will spend the next 6 months on the tarmac, learning what it means to serve this company from the ground up. You will also attend mandatory comprehensive bias and de-escalation training, which you will pay for out of your own pocket. Perhaps a reduction in status and salary will improve your memory of corporate policy. Gerald Finney swayed on his feet, his face a mask of disbelief. The public humiliation was, for him, even more profound than a simple firing. It was a complete and total stripping of status. Third, Solomon's voice grew stronger, more commanding. I am announcing the creation of the Airline Customer Bill of Rights. This will be drafted by my legal team and implemented within the next 48 hours. It will be posted at every gate, on every ticket, and on the front page of your website. It will clearly state in simple language every passenger's right to respectful, unbiased service. It will also outline a new, streamlined process for filing complaints, with a guaranteed response from a real human being within 24 hours. And it will detail mandatory, significant compensation for any passenger who is involuntarily denied boarding. Not a voucher, but a full cash refund and a check for 4 times the ticket value. A wave of applause broke out from the crowd of passengers. They were not just witnessing a corporate takeover, they were witnessing the birth of a pro-consumer revolution. Fourth, he went on, all current Airline training materials regarding customer service are to be considered void. As of today, my foundation, the Johnson Education Initiative, will be taking over the development and implementation of a new mandatory training program for every single employee, from the boardroom to the baggage handlers. The program will be called the Dignity Protocol. Every employee will be recertified within 90 days, or they will no longer work for this airline. Sarah Jenkins, still filming, felt a chill run down her spine. He wasn't just firing people. He wasn't just throwing money at the problem. He was performing open-heart surgery on the entire corporate culture, rewriting its DNA in real time. Finally, Solomon said, delivering his last and perhaps most crucial mandate. For the next 12 months, 20% of all executive bonuses, from the CEO down to the senior vice president level, will be tied directly to customer satisfaction scores and the number of discrimination complaints filed against the airline. If the numbers don't improve, you don't get paid. We will align the financial incentives of management with the basic human dignity of our customers. He paused, letting the weight of his decrees settle. He had just fundamentally restructured the airline's operational and ethical framework in less than 5 minutes, all while standing at a departure gate. "Anna," he said into the phone, "relay those orders to your executive team. A written confirmation that you have begun implementation is to be in my inbox within the hour. Is there any part of that you did not understand?" "No, Solomon," her voice came back, stripped of all its earlier panic, replaced now with the hollow tone of total surrender. "I understand perfectly." "Good," Solomon said. He then handed the phone back to the shell-shocked Gerald Finney. "I believe you have some personnel matters to attend to." As if on cue, 2 more senior-looking airport officials arrived, clearly sent by a frantic corporate office. They approached Finney, who could only point a trembling finger at Mark and then at Brenda. The transfer of authority was complete. The old guard was being swept away. The new mandates were in effect. The reign of Solomon Johnson had begun. The events at Gate B24 did not remain a localized phenomenon. Sarah Jenkins's live stream acted as a digital detonator, and the resulting explosion sent shrapnel flying through the entire global aviation and business landscape. The story was irresistible, a tale of poetic justice so perfect it seemed scripted, combining themes of racial prejudice, corporate arrogance, and the raw, world-altering power of modern capital. Within the hour, the JFK takeover was the #1 trending topic worldwide. Major news networks had dispatched crews to the airport, not just to report on a delayed flight, an event that was now almost comically mundane, but to try and capture the fallout of a corporate earthquake. The stock prices of other major airlines, United, Delta, American, began to dip, not out of any financial weakness, but out of pure, unadulterated fear. The question on every analyst's mind was, if he can do this to Airline, who's next? In a sterile, glass-walled boardroom in Chicago, the CEO of United Airlines had cut short a meeting on quarterly earnings to watch the live feed from JFK on a massive screen. He watched in horrified silence as Solomon Johnson dictated his new mandates. When the stream showed Mark Peterman and Brenda Walsh being escorted away by airport management, he turned to his executive team, his face pale. "I want a full top-down review of our customer service protocols and bias training," he ordered, his voice tight. I want to know how many discrimination complaints we have outstanding and how they were handled. And I want it on my desk by morning. We will not be the next Airline. We will get ahead of this." Similar scenes were playing out in Atlanta, in Dallas, in London, and in Frankfurt. An industry that had grown comfortable with its arcane rules, its legions of disgruntled customers, and its often imperious attitude, was suddenly terrified. Solomon Johnson had not just bought an airline, he had bought himself a platform and had instantly weaponized it. He had exposed a systemic vulnerability that every carrier shared: the immense gap between their glossy marketing about friendly skies and the often grim reality of the passenger experience. The concept of his Customer Bill of Rights and the Dignity Protocol went viral. Passenger advocacy groups, long ignored by the industry, were suddenly flooded with media requests. Pundits on financial news channels were not just discussing the mechanics of the takeover, but the revolutionary nature of the new owner's philosophy. He was tying executive pay directly to customer respect, a simple, powerful idea that was utterly terrifying to the established corporate order. Corporate America was watching too. CEOs of retail chains, hotel groups, and rental car companies saw the writing on the wall. The incident was a brutal lesson in the new realities of the 21st century. Firstly, that every employee is a representative of the brand, and their individual actions can have multi-billion-dollar consequences. Secondly, that in an age of social media, there are no more private mistakes. Every interaction is potentially a global broadcast. And thirdly, that wealth and power were no longer exclusively the domain of the white corporate establishment. There were new kings, like Solomon Johnson, who played by different rules and had the power to enforce them. Solomon's own company, Nexus Corp, was flooded with a deluge of positive press. Their stock, already a market darling, ticked up another 2%. Investors loved the decisiveness, the raw display of power married to a clear, ethical vision. He had inadvertently created the single most effective marketing and PR event in his company's history, all without spending a dime on advertising. He had demonstrated the core ethos of Nexus Corp: identify an inefficient, broken system, and then use overwhelming force and superior intellect to radically reconstruct it. Back at JFK, the shockwave had a more immediate, localized effect. News of the firings and the station manager's dramatic demotion spread like wildfire among the Airline staff. At other gates, agents were suddenly smiling more genuinely. Supervisors were walking the terminals, actively asking passengers if they needed assistance. The fear of God, or rather the fear of Solomon Johnson, had been put into them. The culture had not yet changed, but behavior had, and that was the first step. The shockwave was a cleansing fire. It was a brutal, terrifying, and necessary event that forced an entire industry to look in the mirror and confront the ugly, arrogant reflections staring back at it. Solomon Johnson had wanted to correct a problem. In the process, he had inadvertently launched a global movement. The tremors from Gate B24 were shaking the foundations of corporate power across the world. With the new mandates issued and the old guard being dealt with, a strange sense of calm descended upon Gate B24. The raw, high-stakes drama had concluded. What remained was the quiet, methodical process of restoration. The two disgraced employees, Mark and Brenda, were led away by airport management, their faces streaked with tears, a silent, pathetic procession marking the end of their careers. Gerald Finney, the newly demoted baggage handler, stood alone for a moment, a dazed look on his face, before numbly shuffling off toward the tarmac to begin his new life. A new flight crew, summoned from a standby lounge, arrived at the gate. Their demeanor was starkly different from their predecessors. The gate agent, a sharp professional woman in her 30s, approached Solomon with an expression of profound respect. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I'm Captain Eva Rostova. I'll be flying you and your fellow passengers to London today. On behalf of the entire flight crew, It is an honor to welcome you aboard." There was no fawning, no groveling. It was a simple, dignified statement of professional respect. This was the new Airline. Solomon nodded to her. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate you and your crew stepping in on such short notice." "It's our pleasure, sir," she replied. She then turned to the other passengers who had been waiting with a patience born of witnessing history. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now ready to complete boarding for Flight 815 to London. We apologize again for the delay and thank you for your understanding." The process was smooth, efficient, and respectful. As Solomon walked down the jet bridge, the other first-class passengers who had witnessed the event nodded to him, some offering a quiet "thank you" or "well done." He had not only fought his own battle, he had fought for them, for the principle that a ticket was a contract, and that dignity should be part of the price of admission. When he stepped onto the aircraft, he was greeted by a flight attendant who guided him to his seat. "Mr. Johnson, welcome aboard. Here you are, seat 1A. Can I get you something to drink before we depart? Perhaps a glass of champagne?" "Water would be perfect, thank you," Solomon said, a small, weary smile finally touching his lips. He slid into the plush leather seat, the very seat that had been the catalyst for the entire afternoon's events. It felt right. He stowed his carry-on and looked out the window, watching the ground crew moving with a renewed sense of purpose on the tarmac below. Sarah Jenkins boarded a few minutes later, heading back towards the economy cabin. As she passed his seat, she paused. "Mr. Johnson," she said, a look of awe still in her eyes. "I'm Sarah Jenkins. What you did back there, it was incredible." Solomon looked up at her. "What we did, Ms. Jenkins. Your actions were just as important. You created a record. You bore witness. That takes courage. Thank you." He reached into his wallet and handed her his personal business card. "When you get to London, call my office. I think Nexus Corp could use a journalist with your integrity on a permanent basis. We have a story to tell." Sarah stared at the card, speechless. In a single afternoon, she had gone from a struggling freelancer to being offered a job by one of the most powerful CEOs in the world. She managed a stunned, "Thank you," and continued to her seat, her mind reeling. As the final passenger settled, Captain Rostova's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Airline Flight 815 with service to London. On behalf of the airline and our new leadership, we want to reiterate our commitment to providing every passenger with a safe, respectful, and dignified journey. We thank you for your patience today and for flying with us." The mention of new leadership was a subtle but clear acknowledgement of the new reality. The cabin door was closed. The jet bridge retracted. The plane began to push back from the gate. As it taxied towards the runway, Solomon Johnson leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes for a moment. He hadn't sought this confrontation. He had simply been a man trying to get to his seat. But when confronted with an immovable wall of prejudice, he had chosen not to climb over it, or to chip away at it, but to buy the wall and tear it down completely. The plane accelerated down the runway, a powerful, controlled surge of force. It lifted gracefully into the afternoon sky, banking over the vast expanse of New York City. Solomon looked down at the sprawling metropolis, the Nexus Corp tower gleaming in the distance. The flight was just a flight now, a simple journey from one point to another. But everything had changed. The rightful boarding was complete, not just for him, but for a new era of accountability he had, in the span of a single hour, willed into existence. 3 months later, the fallout from the JFK takeover had settled into a new, industry-defining landscape. The story of Solomon Johnson's 45-minute conquest of Airline had become a modern business legend, a case study taught at Harvard and Stanford, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms worldwide. But for Solomon, the legend was less important than the results, which he was reviewing on a holographic display in his Chicago office overlooking Lake Michigan. The data was clear and compelling. The Dignity Protocol training was now mandatory for all 80,000 Airline employees. Customer satisfaction scores, which had been stagnant for years, were up a staggering 32%. Discrimination complaints had plummeted by 94%. The new transparent complaint system, managed by an independent third-party firm, was being lauded by consumer advocacy groups as a model for the industry. The Customer Bill of Rights was now the most downloaded document on the airline's website. Airline stock, after the initial chaotic spike, had stabilized at a price 25% higher than before the takeover. Wall Street, initially terrified by the hostile nature of the acquisition, now saw the genius in it. Solomon had taken an underperforming asset, surgically removed its cancerous culture, and replaced it with a customer-centric model that was already proving to be more profitable. Happy customers, it turned out, were loyal customers. Sarah Jenkins was now the head of Nexus Corp's new investigative journalism division, Nexus Veritas. Her first project was a deep-dive documentary funded by Solomon's Foundation, exposing systemic biases across the entire travel industry. Her work had already led to 2 congressional hearings. Solomon received a weekly report on the airline's progress. He learned that Gerald Finney had completed his 6-month stint on the tarmac and had, surprisingly, requested to stay in an operational role, stating that he had learned more about the company in those 6 months than he had in the previous 20 years. The culture was, slowly but surely, beginning to heal from the inside. Today's report included a letter forwarded from the new Airline Customer Relations Department. It was from Brenda Walsh. He hesitated for a moment, then opened the file. The letter was not a plea for her job back, nor was it filled with excuses. It was a stark, painful, and deeply honest apology. She wrote about how the public firing, as humiliating as it was, had forced her to confront a prejudice she never realized she had. She had grown up in a small, homogeneous town, and her view of the world was narrow and unexamined. Her actions, she admitted, were born of a toxic combination of stress, a feeling of powerlessness in her own life, and a deep-seated unconscious bias that she was now, through therapy and education, working to dismantle. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply wanted him to know that the event had, in a brutal way, woken her up. Solomon closed the file, a pensive look on his face. The price of a ticket that day had been far more than $8,000. For Brenda and Mark, it had cost them their careers. For Airline's old guard, it had cost them an empire. But for the industry, and for millions of future travelers, the price paid that day had purchased something invaluable, a new standard of dignity. One man's quiet resolve had transformed a moment of personal humiliation into a global movement, proving that the most powerful response to being told you don't belong is to, quite literally, buy the building and rewrite the rules. As we look back on the events at Gate B24, it's easy to focus on the spectacular display of power, the corporate conquest that felt like something out of a movie. But the true story lies deeper, in the quiet psychological currents that led to the initial confrontation. What truly drove Brenda Walsh's actions? It wasn't just a simple case of overt conscious racism. It was something more insidious, a blend of unconscious bias, job-related stress, and a corporate culture that implicitly encouraged detached, procedural interactions over genuine human connection. In her world, passengers were not people. They were data points, problems to be managed. Solomon Johnson didn't fit the expected data pattern for a first-class passenger, and her mind, seeking the path of least resistance, defaulted to a harmful stereotype. If she had been empowered by a system that valued empathy over efficiency, if her training had equipped her to question her own assumptions, the entire incident might have been avoided. For Solomon, the event serves as a powerful, if extreme, lesson in self-protection and strategic response. What if he had reacted differently? Had he yelled and created a scene, he would have played right into their narrative of the disruptive passenger, justifying their actions in the eyes of onlookers and security. His power did not come from raising his voice, but from lowering it, from understanding that the true battle wasn't at the gate, it was on the balance sheet. If he hadn't possessed the immense resources of Nexus Corp, could he have achieved any justice? Perhaps not on this scale. But his method still offers a blueprint. Document everything, remain calm, and apply leverage at the most effective point. For most people, that leverage isn't billions of dollars, but a viral social media post, a well-worded complaint to the Department of Transportation, or participation in a class action lawsuit. His story reminds us that leverage comes in many forms. The ultimate message is one of profound and hopeful accountability. It teaches us that injustice, whether it's in a boardroom or at a boarding gate, thrives in silence and shadows. When a light is shone upon it, whether by a journalist's phone or a multi-billion-dollar takeover, it begins to wither. The actions of one person, when executed with precision and a clear moral purpose, can indeed create ripples that become a tidal wave of change. It is a reminder that the dignity we demand for ourselves is the same dignity we must be willing to fight for on behalf of others. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you felt judged or dismissed based on a first impression? How did you handle it? What do you believe is the most powerful tool an ordinary person has to challenge an unjust system or a large corporation? Thank you for joining us on this journey. Your attention and your stories matter. Please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more stories that challenge the way we see the world.